Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this evening's event, part of our series sponsored by the ILA and focused on foreign relations law, public international law, and private international law. My name is Ewan Smith. I'm Associate Professor of Public Law here at UCL, and I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Tom Poole from the London School of Economics back to our faculty. How to introduce Tom Poole? Well, I think the first thing I have to say is simply welcome back. You are a friend of this faculty, both in the personal sense and the institutional sense, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to hear from you. But for those of you who are hearing from Tom for the first time, he is Professor of Law at the London School of Economics and has been for the last 10 years, and is an absolutely outstanding expert in foreign relations law in the United Kingdom. His 2016 work, Reason of State, is, I think, for me, the key evocation of that principle within the theory of the state and constitutional theory in the UK. He's the author also of a fantastic co-edited volume with David Deisenhouse on the double-facing constitution, which touches on these ideas of the federative power that we're going to be looking at today. And I understand, I'm very pleased to hear that he's currently working on an intellectual history of the federative, working through ideas starting in the 16th century forwards through the period that we're going to look at today. So the paper we're going to discuss is about the idea of the federative in Adam Smith's theory. And Tom, I think if you could speak for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, we'll have time for question and answer at the end. Finally, I know there are many people joining us online. If you are joining us online, you should know that I have one of those faces that's probably better enjoyed in low resolution. So you can get that through Apple general settings. But if you have a question online, please put your hand up and I'll try to keep you involved in the discussion later in the meeting. So over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ewan, for those many half-truths about me. Far too flattering. I'm going to talk to a paper today that might strike many as a bit esoteric. And if after my introduction to the paper, you think it's not for you, then feel free to leave quietly, and I definitely won't hold it against you. Because it's a paper that was written for, and now just been accepted by a journal called Modern Intellectual History. So it's a paper in the history of political thought, essentially, yeah? And written sort of primarily with that audience in mind. Yeah. That said, it's written by me, who's not a historian of political thought, and just dabble in that space, really. My co-author, whose name's Martin Clark, and he's based at Melbourne. And again, he's an international lawyer rather than a historian of political thought. So we're two lawyers doing a history of political thought paper with hopefully some resonance within the world of law, international justice, and foreign relations law. The sort of concept that's been mentioned a few times by Ewan, and that occupies part of the title, the federative. I should tell you a little bit about that before sort of diving into the argument proper. So the federative was used by a bunch of people, I'll tell you about some of those in a second, to sort of capture and describe the foreign affairs, war and peace, treaty power, yeah, the constitutional capacity that connects within the state, that connects outwards. Yeah? So this double-facing sort of power provision or capacity within the state that determines stuff internally, but also looks outside and engages outside. So it's double-facing in that sense. As far as we can tell, it's John Locke who came out with that term. Yeah, he comes out and talks about it diffidently to some extent in the Second Treatise of Government. And he uses it as part of his, I guess, separation of powers analysis, saying, to distinguish between different capacities, obviously the legislative, but also within the sort of executive branch between different sorts of powers, most notably the ordinary executive power, so typically the power the executive has to enact and implement and apply laws that are given by the legislature, but also to distinguish it from prerogative power, which he sees as something distinct and different, much more discretionary. The typical context is emergency, where there's need for action, perhaps even outside or against the laws. The federative, the foreign relations power, he sees as distinct, typically held by the same executive official or set of officials, housed within the same office, but a distinct capacity. And that sort of is quite influential I don't want to overstate the case. There's a lot of people downstream from Locke who talk in those terms. Yeah, perhaps the key one before Smith is Montesquieu. He was massively influential. I'm only recently trying to get to grips with how massively influential Montesquieu is, not just in obviously the American context, we all know about that, but also in the British and wider context too. In relation to Montesquieu, yeah, the separation of power analysis we think we know from Montesquieu is, well, the first iteration of it actually basically replicates in different language Locke's. Yeah, he talks about the legislative capacity in the spirit of the laws, distinguish that from, quote, executive power over the things depending on the right of nations, that's the Lockean Federative, and, quote, the executive power over the things depending on the civil right, which for Locke would be the ordinary domestic executive power. Yeah, so he sort of more or less replicates Locke's taxonomy in his own, but gives them a different sense in a different context. And obviously, Adam Smith is sitting sort of nicely downstream of this tradition. He's picking up, he references both Locke and Montesquieu by name. And when he talks about the Federative, and as much as he refers to the Federative, he's obviously using them as a sort of starting point. Now, one question is, why did writers like Locke and Montesquieu and so on start drawing on referring to a federative power separate from other aspects of executive power? I think it's partly that they're starting to think in a serious way about the idea of constitution, of constituted power and authority, yeah? And that involved them, particularly those either within the Republican tradition or like Locke, pretty allied to the Republican tradition. It often got them reflecting quite heavily on the ordering or separation of constituted powers. And that's why they sort of say, well, there's something different about foreign relations, something distinct, isn't there? It's a different zone of interaction. It's not just within the states. Other things about which the state hasn't got control, for instance, its dealings with foreign powers of one sort or another. And there's a sort of different sort of aspect or tenor to that engagement. Often it's the world of prudence rather than hard law, for instance, and lots of room for negotiation and diplomacy rather than something more hard-edged or administrative in a more typical sense. There's another aspect of this engagement, I think, which correlates with sort of conditions of modernity. I think this is very, very obvious in Smith, perhaps less so in Locke, who's writing in an earlier stage, I guess. But I suppose in this context, it's certainly within the 18th century, but to some extent earlier, you've got a much more pronounced and obvious international dimension, obviously tied in with growing colonialism and empire, but generally speaking, you've got a much more pronounced and increasingly sophisticated international dimension. And also, as a result, a much more concern about the possible feedback loop, the feedback implications of that interaction. For instance, if you go out and conquer India through the use of subordinate commercial powers, and they can come back enriched and all coming out with a different normative structure, and they can infect your own internal constitutions. There's lots of concerns about what might happen as a result of external speculation interaction within the internal constitution, which tends to be their starting and end point, most of these thinkers. And as part of that modernity, we've got, and this is very obvious in Smith, two massively important themes for him. One is the idea of commerce, classic 18th century term, by which Smith and other people mean not just economic interaction, trade and so on, but also sort of wider social and cultural interaction and development. And the other term, again, which I've mentioned already, but is massively obvious in this context, perhaps it wasn't a century before, is the idea of empire, which often produces really problematic, from these theorists' points in particular, liberals and Republicans, we call them now, perhaps most of them, really problematic instantiations and problematic forms of political association. And they're confronted with this as a real aspect of state policy, and so on and so forth. So this is why I think that they're thinking about foreign relations. These are the things that are sort of driving them. And this is why at least some of them are light on the term and the idea of the federative. Now, I don't know how much anybody knows about Adam Smith or cares about Adam Smith, but there's difficulties in working for his texts. There's difficulty, interpretive, exegetical, things that you have to encounter when trying to work through Adam Smith to sort of pull out something that he says about the federative or about these foreign relations and constitutional aspects. In the paper that I'm going to run through the arguments in a moment or two, the first part is about what I call the internal federative, so the way in which the internal state constitution arranges its foreign relations or federative power. The second part deals with what we call the external federative, so the way in which various federatives from different nations sort of collide and interact in the international federative space. Now, there's difficulties associated with both those when we try to sort of extrapolate or work out what Smith says in respect of both. In relation to the internal federative, the problem is there that he does use the federative. Yay, so that's great in terms of textual support, and fairly consistently in that context. But the primary text, not the only text here, but the biggest text is so-called lectures on jurisprudence, And they're what they said are, they're lectures on jurisprudence. The problem is Smith didn't write them. We have two texts from two different lecture series, a few years apart, by students, different students. So they write down the notes, and then at a certain point, they get published after Smith's death, So they're not, in a sense, they are Smith, but they're not Smith. And they're certainly not streamlined and systematic and beautiful like real Smith texts are. So we've got a problem. We've got student texts, and we've got two sets of them. And also, a lot of the work, a lot of the interesting stuff that we want to extract is buried in a classic Scottish Enlightenment stable conjectural history. Let's imagine the world having developed through these stages. So you have to identify the federative in the course of this elaboration that itself is really a student repeating or ventriloquizing voice to master in this case. So that's the difficulty in relation to the internal federative. In relation to the external federative, well, we have a bit of a problem here. We have a wonderful text, primary text of the Wealth of Nations here, which is a masterpiece, and Smith, in this context, is a gorgeous writer. Really beautiful. Takes his time sometimes, but really beautiful, really insightful. Can be quite polemical too. But there's a beauty and a joy to reading Smith. But in this context, he doesn't use the term federative. He's not really so much into institutional analysis like he was in the lectures on jurisprudence. He's into a big canvas picture of commercial empire and its ills, and its evils even. So that's part of the problem. We have some other texts, though, which sort of help us on that. So we're going to have to extrapolate in the Wealth of Nations stuff that he says about commercial empire and monopoly trading companies and so on to try and pull out what he's saying about the external federative. But he also happily for us in the Wealth of Nations does at one point talk about the federative in effect. And it's in relation specifically to the problems that him and his contemporaries were facing with America and the colonies going AWOL. He's saying, okay, well, what do we do about this? And he's not alone in this, but his preferred plan is essentially a federative union. He calls it a federal union. He doesn't mean that. He means a federative union, an alliance of newly independent states, America on one hand, the former colonies, and the UK, Great Britain on the other. Happily as well, he also writes this analysis up in another context, in a letter, a couple of letters, published to his old friend who also happened to be a Scot and was Solicitor General at the time of the UK, of Great Britain, who sort of asked Smith, then a very renowned figure, for sort of consultancy. So what would you do if you face? What are the options and what do you advise us to do in an ideal universe? So he writes in that context again about the federative and this federative union idea specifically. So we do have a fair bit we can put together on the external side to make something of it. So there's a lot of effort in playing through Smith in this context, both in the internal side and the external side, which we have to sort of confront and sort of own up to. What are the benefits of putting this together? Well, I don't know, there's something very satisfying about finding what you see, what one sees as sort of consistent threads through often difficult, but really profoundly insightful, often material. He's also much, much thicker and stickier, the picture he gives, than, say, John Locke. He's writing at a different time and downstream of all this stuff, but he's much, much more interested in the way in which law and justice fits within really complicated social structures that are at least in part material as well as it were, sentimental, motivated by passions and all sorts of concerns, which may or may not be entirely rational. So he's got a deep profound reflection on society, the development of society, particularly under conditions of modernity, and the sort of sentimental structure that sustains societies, as you call it. And that's really interesting. I think that's really, really interesting in Smith, and perhaps a more general application thereafter. So that's introduction. Far too long, but I think necessary as it gets to the starting line, or I hope it's necessary. So let's think about this internal federative. So the way in which the federative or foreign relations power sort of sits within a broader picture of the structure of the government and the constitution. So the question for Smith is, well, how do we approach this? What's the method going to be? Yeah. And his method, as we've already said, is distinctive to him, but also distinctive to the sort of tradition of the Scottish Enlightenment that was already pretty well developed by the time he was writing. So he says, in order to, quote, acquire proper notions of government, it's necessary to consider the first form of it and observe how the other forms arose out of it. Yeah? So he's saying, okay, we could have some sort of, sort of almost stipulative starting point before the mists of time, and we're going to develop through sort of stages of development. Looking at historical material, so it's not just making it up, it's not purely speculative, but it is, sort of philosophical history rather than sort of actual history. Yeah? He's not going into details. He's saying, look, broadly we can reconstruct the logic of these societies along these forms or whatever. So when you start, he starts in a sort of, a sort of his functional equivalent of the Hobbes state of nature. So, okay, let's imagine when human societies were at their most basic. They weren't even much like societies at all in that form. The age of hunters, as he calls it, he means hunter-gatherers. Yeah. So let's imagine societies in states where there's either no government or virtually no government at all. But even at this stage, we have glimmers of what is to become the federative. Yeah, because obviously it connects to things really fundamental like collective security, we call it today, decisions about war and peace. Yeah, and in any human societies, you're going to have this sort of stuff occurring. And interestingly, sort of perhaps obviously in a sense, he thinks that those are in a sense democratic at that time. Yeah, they're decisions by the body of whatever the collective is at that point. Yeah, and it's interesting from that starting point, the first form of what is to become the federative. Two things are very interesting. One is the federative is the first, as it were, glimmer of an institution of government to emerge. So in a sense, it's primordial. But also he thinks it's democratic. He uses that term, as I say, and that term democracy will resonate throughout a lot of the stages, surprisingly, of his conjectural story to come. So you have this semi-mythical point of origin, and Smith from that point on shows how this sort of federative concept moved slowly into focus as part of the gradual stratification and hardening of the governing apparatus in which it's housed. Yeah? So he's writing really the intersection between, juridical form and sort of political sociology. These are sort of entwined in a really quite interesting way, and classically sort of Smithian way, I guess. And what's quite interesting, as I've already alluded to, is that while many of these stages sort of seem to operate according to sort of monarchical forms or something like that, is that actually, even though they appear monarchical, at least when it comes to these fundamental federative questions, they're essentially democratical still. Yeah. So the next stage, he calls the age of shepherds, which sounds really benign. They're not. Think Genghis Khan. Yeah, it's the big herders. Yeah. So we're talking about leaders of warlike bands. Yeah, typically, not just, but there's a lot of that going on. And he says, quote, a state of this sort to a careless observer would appear to be monarchical. Well, seem monarchical to me, in as much as I ever thought about it. So perhaps I'm a careless observer. He says, if you look harder, actually you see a base is democratic. Yeah. And you think about why. So even though the warlord, Genghis Khan, went out saying, we're going to fight these people, whatever, yeah. In the end, to get the war band going, basically people have to buy into it. Yeah. In conditions where there's no sort of independent, there's not much administrative apparatus, like courts and officials and all that sort of stuff, to impose sanctions to get people who might be recalcitrant to come in. So you've got to get a good number of people, maybe a majority of people pitching in and going, yeah, let's go and kill these people. Otherwise, you're not going to get the war band, which is wonderfully acute, very, very classically Smith. Things appear like this, but actually their logic is their structural logic underlying it all is often very different. The age of agriculture gets quite interesting. So we get, proper settled communities, we get cities and all that sort of stuff, walls, all the stuff that Smith gets very excited about. Carl Schmitt gets really excited about as the basics of politics. And And at this point, you start getting differentiation. You get, lots and lots of things that look like straightforward kingships. Smith doubts whether they are. He thinks they're in essence, again, still democracies. Counterintuitively, quote, the king, as he was called, was no more than a leading man who had a superior influence in their deliberations. No more than that. It's not sovereignty as we would come to know it in much more modern eras. Also at this point, as well as these sort of early kingships, you also get the first explicitly republican regimes in Greece in particular, and also later in Rome. I'm mentioning Rome. I'm not going to talk too much about Rome, but Rome is really important. Rome is sort of, he's mates with Edward Gibbon, so they're all into Rome and the collapse of Rome and how that's a big deal. And Rome and its collapse is very important. So Rome is declension from republic to monarchy is something that he finds still very troubling. And in its its imperial forms, he does see it as a true monarchy. That is a military monarchy that's deciding stuff, that has the federative in its arsenal as well as every other political power, institutional power. But its collapse, Rome's collapse, eventually set back European civilization to them a lot, he thinks, not unconventionally at all. And in effect, you get this sort of, in a sense, you get a collapse, and Rome, in a sense, being, sort of responsible for that. You get the rise of various sort of ideas of lordship and subjugation, but you also get the sort of almost the remnants, all the relics of Roman power, Roman civilizational sort of soft power in various trading towns. There's a big part of sort of the development of modernity in Smith's account. And they manage in this sort of maelstrom just about to hold on and develop in time sort of independent footing. And it's quite interesting for Smith that he brings in and makes connections between these sort of little sort of microcosms of incipient freedom, if you like, and the federative form. He notes that a lot of these, particularly in Dutch and German territories, he said these are federative republics. He notes this and talks about them in these terms and makes that sort of connection. Now, that's the long-term game. He sort of starts, as you'd expect, when it comes to sort of his own modern times, modernity, to sort of slow down a bit, And he sort of starts thinking also more obviously normatively. There's been a normative sort of element to what's gone on before, but it hasn't been remotely pronounced. Obviously, at this point, he starts thinking about how do we get norms out of this sort of historical morass, as it were. One thing he does, which is really interesting, is look at and accept that modernity equates to institutional complexity. Modernity means you have more complex societies, and that's sort of pretty obvious. But interestingly, and maybe also diversity, although there's certainly complexity. He says, well, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that things get normatively tricky. In fact, actually, often the opposite is true. That actually developing in complexity over time often equates in other contexts, particularly languages, theory of languages, that we get more complicated about stuff. We have much more vocabulary, we have more intricate stuff that we can do grammatically and syntactically with language. But as that happens, the rules about language become more obvious. You can actually state the norms of language more easily as they become complex, because you sort of have to. You have to find the rules to sustain it. I think the same is true in the political world. With more complexity, actually, you get normative clarity, and things become more obvious. The principles and rules that underlie the game become sort of clearer. Now, he has at this point a story, I'm not going to go into it, I think it's absolutely fascinating, a story on the evolution of separation of powers, which is just brilliant, really, really interesting, and various stages of it aren't at all obvious. But I'm going to skip over that. We can talk about that if you want to later. But I'm going to talk to the stuff that's closer to the federative. And in this context, he says, well, look, there's lots of complexity, there's lots of diversity, but really we have two main forms. We have regular monarchy, and this sounds very much like Montesquieu. We have regular monarchy, as in France, and we have commercial republics, as in Great Britain, emblematically, but not just there. The Dutch Republic would also be an example. And he says, actually, that Britain, I don't think he's just being purely sort of nationalistic. He said Britain actually exemplifies, is the best example of a modern polity. Why? Because it's got the most developed rules. It's got the most intricate institutional patterning, and there's a lot of rules that play in relation to that institutional patterning. That's not so true of France, because you have this, you sort of buy into this idea of absolutism in relation to their kingship. Obviously, the English polity, or the British polity by this point, worked along different lines according to different logics. So how does that relate in relation to the federative, say? So he says, quote, well, this earliest branch of the supreme power, remember, it's the one that forms before the other because it sort of has to. Yeah? It's the sort of thing that's closely connected with survival of the collective. This earliest branch of the supreme power is therefore at first exercised precariously. In all conditions, particularly if you think, Genghis Khan, yeah, it's still very precarious. The relationship between the control of the federative and the institutional structure of rule or power of command is actually much more precarious than it might present itself. Yeah? Because why? Because, well, at best it's split between the government and the people. Really, the people have the lion's share of the say when push comes to shove. He says that's not true anymore. Yeah. Now the federative is altogether absolute, he says. Now, by absolute doesn't mean you can do what you want if you're the holder or the wielder of this power, but it doesn't mean something held without limit then, but rather something more akin to sort of self-evident and undeniable. The other people in the picture will go, yeah, of course you have the power. Yeah, but it's in a sense a starting point, that of course, rather than the end point, as we'll see. So within, say, the British Constitution, where you have institutionally divided power, this idea and this sort of separation of powers identifies and clarifies the location of authority, and that in turn facilitates the effective operation of public power, he thinks. Yeah? So there's two organizing principles in play here. First, the idea that each of the primary institutions is sovereign, or absolute as he calls it, in respect of their province or own sphere of activity. Yeah. So if you're the king, you control the federative. If you're parliament, you control the purse, and so on and so forth. The judges, you control the interpretation and meaning of the law. But second, the principle that the exercise of power by those primary institutions is subject to checks and controls, including from the other primary institutions, which stop short of curtailing that sovereign capacity, but are sufficient to prevent misuse, maladministration, and injustice. So that's the idea. Yeah, it's got this sense of separation of powers, both clarifying lines of authority, but also finding a way of, as it were, checking and balancing it out. And that, for him, is most manifest in the British constitutional structure of his time. Okay, that's enough on the internal side of things. I'm going to move on now to the external federative, the big picture stuff. What happens when we move away from these shores to some extent? Now, as I said before, the difficulty is we're going to have to piece together critical reflections by Smith on what was his contemporary international commercial society, and specifically its structure and constellation of commerce, foreign relations, and law. Yeah, so we're going to have to sort of piece together that from particularly wealth of nations, but not just there. Now, the position I think he ultimately reaches is that the current imperial structures of domination and exploitation should ideally be supplanted by federative arrangements. Yeah? The objective being the recognition of independent states entering freely into arrangements of friendship based on cooperation and mutual respect. Yeah, so that's a sort of governing ambition. But he's very Smith about this. Yeah, he's not naive. He's he might be idealistic, but he's incredibly aware of the precarity of things. Yeah, that things are constantly fragile. They're always in flux, and they're developing. And that's all the more so, whether that's true in politics, what one thing, but it's even more true in spades in the international arena. Now, I'm going to illustrate that position in the end when we look at this sort of his solution, his proposals in respect of the American crisis. But before that, we should look at the critique. Yeah, the critique of imperial commercial society that dominated his time and dominates the Wealth of Nations as well. So in that book, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith shows how European colonial rule was detrimental both to the metropolitan and the conquered non-European societies alike. Yeah, it's bad for everybody is the theme of the book. The practice of empire proved, quote, ruinous and destructive to native societies because of, quote, savage injustice of the Europeans and their use of exclusive monopoly trading companies for long distance. These systems of colonial rule were perfectly destructive, he says, as subjects laboured under the strange absurdity, quote again, of extractive private trading companies acting the part of the sovereign. So that's the sort of general critical theme of engagement of the book. What I'd like to pick out from that critical engagement is what you might call the privatization of the federative. Yeah? So we're talking about what is effect the delegation of sovereign capacities, particularly federative capacities, from in the British state or any other European state to monopoly trading companies going to India or wherever they're going. Yeah? So these activities explicitly linked to the federative would include, quote, the right of possessing forts and garrisons in distant and barbarous countries, which is necessarily, he says, connected to the right of making peace and war in those countries. Yeah? So they're given explicitly sovereign federative capacities, but in the charters which allow them and enable them to operate in these spaces. Yeah. Now, the effect of that, which has become clear by Smith's time and was going to become even more clear in subsequent decades, so that, you know, in these contexts where you get these delegated power to, you know, people are there to make a buck, yeah, as quickly as possible, and that's, you know, in a sense their main or their overriding interest. What you get is almost invariably an exercise of these sovereign capacities, which is unjust, capricious, and cruel, are his words. Yeah, it's almost always corrupted the federative when used for private extractive ends, as in these contexts. Yeah, so that's part of the criticism, and obviously correlates with and involves and implicates the federative. Now, that account is sort of, you know, standard issue Smith, and I suspect everybody's to some extent in the room familiar with that sort of attack. The interesting thing is to try and sort of say what he was, you know, what sort of vision he had arising from the critique, which would respond to it and potentially ameliorate the situation. Yeah? And I think here the argument is that if it can escape the shadow of empire, the federative offers an alternative paradigm through which public power and popular sentiments may be reorganized both within and outside the state and between the state, so to correct the excesses and injustices of commercial empire. Yeah? So the idea is to get the same basic elements, commerce, foreign relations, law, prudence, and remix them. Yeah, remix them in a way that's more productive to reasonable relations between nations, and that might, with a bit of luck and lots of good strategic action, provide the foundations of a new international order based on different sort of structure and grounding principles. Now, the difficulty has been how to get there. How do we get from this to that? Yeah, and he knows that this is a big order magnitude to get there. But one thing he's very clear about is one of the things that will need to change is sentiments. Yeah, it's one thing to rationalize the constitutional architecture, say. It's another thing to change and educate public sentiments to run along different logics and different cores. And what he thinks is needed is the inculcation within political debate of something we might call federative sentiments. Yeah, people have got to learn that modern warfare is debilitatingly costly. Yeah, it's swingingly costly and in the end counterproductive. Yeah, what is a big problem is the sense of glory. Yeah, the sense of the idea being about love of country being tied to crude forms of patriotism, in which we want to look to get one over our competitor nations, particularly the bloody French. And instead look at patriotism as consisting instead, quote, in love for the laws and institutions that preserve peace and promote the well-being of one's fellow citizens. Yeah, but he knows more as well as anybody that, you know, that's going to be a massively tall order. Just as in his time, perhaps even more than our time, there's a sort of crude nationalistic spirit that was very, very much the order of the day, right down to the end. Now, it was all very abstract, all very nice. Is there something that he says that's slightly less abstract? Well, I think there's two things, yeah? The second one's going to be the sort of proposal for America, which is sort of emblematic and a good example, and something that's obviously much more concrete, though still speculative. The other thing before that, which is sort of in the intermediate space, is that you have to start building up a set of, I don't know, sort of maxims or basic principles with it to start negotiating, working out relationships between nations built on a different basis. Yeah. So the first one, you need to sort of develop what you might call a foreign relations maxim. Yeah. Nations needed to adopt the injunction against destabilizing other nations through aggressive or otherwise improper action. Yeah. Now, again, it's not going to be the determining thing in every single case. There, a prudent statesman, and we're going to talk about prudence in a moment, will obviously tailor what's necessary, what is the best course of action, depending on what exact circumstances are facing, who you're talking with, and so on and so forth. And the other sort of principle idea is the idea of prudence. So you want this foreign relations maxim, providing a sort of working injunction against the wrong sort of aggressive action. And you also need prudence, which he simply means by which the superior reasoned understanding that enables to discern, quote, the remote consequences of all our actions and the costs and benefits likely to result from them. Yeah. So that's his sort of, that's his sort of middle level sort of suggestion. At the level of detail, we only get one proposal, and that's America. Yeah, but it's very, in a sense, practical. So we've got this problem. What's going to happen? Yeah, what's going to happen, and how are we going to go about this? And in two spaces, one, the Wealth of Nations, and then this set of letters to Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General. He says, okay, well, what are we going to do about this? Okay, so the idea here works through different proposals, but in the end, is preferred one is a federative union, a treaty-based agreement to recognize the independence of America and establish conditions of comity and commerce between the two newly independent powers. So that's the best way forward. Yeah? That faces the reality of where we are and responds to it in a rational, prudent way. Yeah, of course, that's not what's happened, not what eventuates, but there we go. He would have also predicted that, I think. And beyond that, and through those proposals, we get a glimpse of what, as it were, the new federative ought to look like. Yeah, it's in this context, he's articulating a truly federative international order as the connection of legislatures rather than diplomats or sovereigns. Yeah, he's thinking about ways in which you can stabilize arrangements so that public interest can speak out, so that the will of the nation, the will of people, both at the level of the nation but also beyond nations, can be sort of made manifest in these longer-lasting relations of peace. Do I need to go into details on the arrangements? I can if you want, but they're basically treaty-based arrangements seeking to guarantee peace between America, newly independent America, and Britain. Now that of course costs Britain's imperial honour. That'll be it's a bit of pill to swallow. The French would laugh at you. It's going to be awful, yeah. And the danger is going to be that patriots, wrong sort of patriots on either side, both the Americans and the British, are going to do all they can to get in the way of it, which is of course what happens in reality. But he says, but that's where the interest lies. The common interest is producing that sort of stuff, and you have to work hard together institutionally, but also at the sentimental level to try and get there. And that's it.
We have a little more than 20 minutes left, so I'm going to kick off the discussion, and I want to start with the note of apology with which you began your paper. You said this is an unfamiliar idea, and I'm not sure I completely agree. I think it's an idea with which you present with great clarity and great insight. But you're right. I know there are people in this room who've encountered the idea for the federative for the first time within the last few months. Yeah. And I see some nodding. And so my question actually is a whole quite simple question, which is, well, what happens next? Why don't we arrive at university with an idea of the federative? And I just want to mention one fact in answering that, in asking that question. So at the turn of the Victorian period, so between Victoria's death and the First World War, the UK has 2 home ministries, Treasury and Home Department, and 4 foreign ministries. The United States has 7 home ministries and 3 foreign ministries. France has 8 home ministries, 3 foreign ministries. So again, this outsized vision of the UK's double-facing federative power is part and parcel of our institutional arrangements until really quite late in the 20th century. What happens next? Is it just sort of US high school civics that crowds the space in which we might be talking about this idea, or how does this idea evolve after Smith's death?
That's really good. Well, I think there's there's a problematic set of histories, which I don't talk about in this paper. I gesture at, but I don't talk about. I think there's obviously, none of what Smith, wants to happen happens, basically, and you sort of run out of sort of optimism on this point. I think more particularly when it comes to treaty making agreements, which in a certain sense, when particularly understood and constituted, are the sort of great hope here, not just in Smith, but perhaps the whole line of thinking. I mean, if you look at the history of treaty making in the imperial context, particularly with indigenous tribes, it's just horrifying. Yeah, it's used as a term and precisely as a tool of domination. So there's an internal problem with treaty and treaty making capacity, which gets associated directly with foreign stuff. I mean, again, that's not necessarily incompatible with Smith's approach, because then, if you don't get these things lined up at the sentimental level, the level of principle, we might call it, then you can have a problem. I think more specifically looking at, and that's a sort of history of the sort of broadly the 19th century. I think looking into the 20th century, I think there's sort of two developments I pick out. One is historical, and the other is sort of more conceptual. So the historical side, in relation to sort of Britain and British sort of university, especially law school education. If you look back, it's astounding. Somebody, Donald Coffey, gave a paper at LSE maybe last year, and he just gone and spent the day looking at old exam papers, so 1910, 1915, that sort of time, University of London, LSE type exam papers, and also curriculum. The curriculum is utterly different. And one of the things it's different about is that it's just so much more international. Not international, also public international courses, but it'll have things on, subjects on what they call Mohammedan law and Mohammedan land law, and all this sort of stuff. Lots and lots of imperial stuff, as you'd expect, but imperial colonial law. And there's lots of writing in that space at that time that people are used to. If you're situated in a British context, you're used to, thinking about these things, including foreign relations stuff, as part of just your natural way of looking at the world and doing business. So if you're a public lawyer, like Ivor Jennings, say, writing at LSE or London or whatever, in the early part of the 20th century, you write on British constitutional law. He writes a fantastic book on the cabinet, for instance, still the go-to book on the cabinet. And he also, at the same time, I don't know how he managed to do it, writes, the sort of standard text on, British Commonwealth, well, what becomes Commonwealth at that time, imperial laws, constitutional law. That's what you do. That's how you see the world, and that drops out. So what you get with the collapse of empire, which in many ways is a good thing, is a turn inwards. And so you get this sort of sense of and the narrowing of vision to some extent within, but which is it is a sort of unintended consequence. And these things they stop being obvious things that most people feel that they need to attend to as being a lawyer, whether an academic lawyer, scholarly lawyer, or a practicing lawyer, one sort or another. I think the other thing relates conceptually to the idea of sovereignty. And I think, in a sense, the Smith vision, which is also the Locke vision, which is probably the Montesquieu vision, although I haven't done it properly yet, is basically saying, you've got to understand sovereignty in a different way from the way it might be understood in a more Hobbesian tradition. That if you think about sovereignty as this dominating, decisive capacity, jurisdictional but also power attached to it, then that's going to be problematic. That's going to be problematic in various regards. And I think we tend to operate, not always, not consistently, but we tend to operate under a vision of sovereignty that owes more to people like Hobbes than people like Smith or even Locke. And when we parrot wrongly, really, we parrot Dyson parliamentary sovereignty, we think that correlates with Hobbes. Then this is what we're doing. I actually think probably Dyson fits, if anything, better than the other tradition, but it's a different fight. So the conceptual point is that sovereignty dominates the narrative, and a particular conception of it sort of washes out the other stuff. Foreign relations, well, that's for other people. That's for the international lawyers, whoever they are, and they're not really lawyers, of course. You
heard it here first. One further question, and then I'll go to the floor. I think this is a question that sat with me while I was reading the paper. You repeatedly call this a double fee inquiry. I understand why you do, basically, rather long. And my question is it really? And the reason I'm asking the question is, as you acknowledge in the paper, the home and foreign dimensions of this federative are written in different modes. The home dimension has a sort of detailed social history. The foreign dimension is a little bit more slipshod, but I think might be better described as a set of value judgments. And the thing that struck me, particularly reading the final few pages and the conclusion you make about the American examples, is that this isn't a power whose foreign dimension bears upon the home dimension at all. So Smith's aspiration for the way that we ought to organise the home, for example, how we should organise our legislature in light of our foreign interests, isn't just a thwarted aspiration. He recognises it as something that's relatively unrealistic while he's already voicing it. And so I wonder whether this is best thought of as two sides of the same coin, as a bivalent thing whose different aspects face each other. Or whether ultimately we're the captives of our history, and the best we can do in foreign affairs is live within the institutions that we have.
I'm also unsure about the metaphor, whatever it is, of double facing. I have a degree of uncertainty about it. What I do think it draws attention to, so I'm not necessarily committed to that image. But what intrigues me, and what these writers were onto, I mean, definitely locks onto it. Straight from the say, look, like they're all taking these decisions are all taking part in the same space, often by the same people, but that's a separate matter. They're taken in Whitehall now. So they're decisions about the way in which the country's run and the laws are applied here, but they're also taking a different sort of decision about what's happening out there to, say British officials who are based in X, Y, or the operation of the armed forces, wherever. So they're the same sort of things, but looking outwards. And I think there's a tendency, again, perhaps it connects with the point about sovereignty and our misunderstanding of the concept, but there's a tendency to think of it as something that's out there in a different way. So that there's a disassociation between where the decision's actually taken, which is Whitehall, whatever, Downing Street, and the effect of that, which might be in Afghanistan. And to see it as, oh, well, that's somehow other and different and distinct. Where you think, but it's not. It's exactly a constitutional decision. It's done with a distinct and different one, perhaps. But done within the same intensity of the power and the same authority structure that the police here are organised. So it's something that captures the fact that it's both sort of in the context of the federative, sort of internally rooted, constitutionally rooted, but also sort of sending feelers out or resonating elsewhere and so on and so forth. I'm sort of after ways of capturing that. As I say, double facing sort of captures aspects of that, but also is leading in certain respects. I take that.
Let me open the questioning to the floor. What I'd like to do, can you put your hand up high if you'd like to ask a question? I'll get a sense of how hot the room is. I think I can probably take these three questions, then give us a chance to respond then. I'm not going to ask in any particular order, but Robert, do you want to go first?
Sure.
Please announce who you are for everyone online.
I'm Robert Craig at University of Bristol. Thank you, Tom. That was as fluent and engaging as always. I've got a very specific question and a broader question. The specific question is, what do you think? Because I'm not sure that I know about whether Locke is right or Adam Smith to an extent that federative power is not part of the prerogative. Because I'm not sure what you think. Because I can see Locke doesn't think that part of it. But you said something at the beginning which struck me, which was that you think that prerogative or federative power is in a sense lawless, but you also said prerogative is in a sense, Locke's sense, outside the law. So to what extent are they really differentiated in your mind? And the second more general question is that in all your presentations and work generally, I get a strong pressing sense all the time that you want to locate or at least root current values in your research, in your discoveries thereof, if you like. I get a strong sense of that all the time. And that's a valuable aspect of the project, I'm sure, of those projects. But what I would also like perhaps more of is those moments where there's dissonance. Because is it not, are we as likely to learn more from those moments of dissonance than the moments of coincidence? And in particular, for example, I think the paradigm example today was you latched onto Smith's claim that that Genghis Khan was a Democrat. Now,
No.
I'm taking the mickey slightly, but this idea that we can locate these democratic values or whatever values we kind of like now historically. Maybe I misunderstood you completely, but that I want a bit less of that and a bit more of the things that we can learn from these cultures back.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. George, can I come to you next? I'll take the questions in sequence.
Thanks, Tom. That was fascinating. I have to apologize that last time I read Smith was when I was a student, so I don't
Only 2 years ago then.
But I found it really interesting the account you gave of the bottom-up nature of authority and questionable legitimacy. And it seems to me, if I understand correctly, that if we can think of terms of monism and dualism, that for Smith, a state is not just imposing itself on citizens, but imposing the international structure or order of which a state forms part. Which I think is a very sort of contemporary picture. And therefore, if you want checks on the legislature internally, then you want to say checks on the foreign relations power because a government imposes a whole system on you. And that monist picture, I think, but even though it's very contemporary in terms of philosophically speaking, I think legally, again, correct me if I'm wrong, legally speaking, it's still very dualist in the way in which lawyers think and politicians think and so on. And my question again, is that a fair account of Smith? But secondly, on your view, can we get to the sentiment that Smith talks about within a dualist picture? Or do we need to just be more monist?
Philip, can I come to you next?
Sorry, Philip Schofield from here. I was wondering whether you thought Smith might be thinking about Scotland. On the one hand, you've got Blackstone telling us that in every state there is one absolute supreme, irresistible power, which as the Jura Summa Imperial. And on the other hand, the historian Richard Watmore telling us about how people were worried about the commercial monarchies gobbling up all the small states, and the way that Scotland managed to survive was through union in England. And so I wonder whether
that's really interesting.
Back of Smith's mind when he's talking about America is Scotland, and there's also the Irish problem.
Which another context where that isn't solved by treaty. It definitely isn't solved by treaty. Perhaps it's unsolvable, but that's really interesting.
Let me hand back over to you.
Robert, thanks so much. On the specific question, so I guess it depends what you mean by is the federative part of the prerogative in the British Constitution. So if it's sort of an aspect of pure analysis, where does the federative get, as it were, housed? Then it's mostly in the prerogative, or mostly gets exercised in respect of prerogative capacities. That's unquestionably true. There's a sort of different level of analysis, which I think certainly it's clearest in Locke, but I think probably consistent in Smith. It's just Locke is much clearer on this point, perhaps on many points, because it's a simpler sort of set of tools he's working with, I guess. But he said, look, they're different capacities. They're simply different capacities. I mean, how you might want them to work is a different question, but they do different things. So the prerogative is, for instance, just stipulatively, is about what you do domestically. And the federative is about what you do in respect of, stuff outside the state, even if the decisions are taken here, but they're to do with things outside the realm. I think there's something in that distinction. I think they do. I think when you for a whole bunch of reasons, some that are sort of pretty obvious about what that entails, both sort of pragmatically. You're thinking about negotiation and prudence rather than things that are mapped out in the way we understand domestic law and regulation typically to be. But you also have different, there's a basic assumption about how you treat people within your own political association is distinct from how you treat people outside. And that runs through, obviously through Smith as just about everybody else, certainly this time, but throughout and most contexts. So I think that makes sense to me. How it cashes out is a different point, but that starting point makes sense to me. Whether it's productive is a different thing. The general question about the current values and looking for consonants rather than dissonance, it's quite interesting. The point about the specific example of Genghis Khan is misplaced. He's not saying that they're democratic. He's saying in the end it's a popular power. And he gives sort of structural reasons for thinking that. I actually think interesting. I think there's there's a lot of points at which you look at anybody, but including Smith, who's recognisably a modern writer in a way that Locke isn't quite. Locke for me feels both medieval and modern. Smith feels very modern. His concerns are our concerns pretty much, although he's differently situated, and he speaks more directly in a way, in an idiom, a language that's sort of more sort of easily translatable, reaches across the time. On the other hand, there's lots of stuff there, both in terms of language, but also in terms of concept, that is also quite jarring. So, for instance, working through the word absolute, which he doesn't mean by absolute. What on earth do you mean by absolute powers in relation to this? Some of the stuff he says about the constitutional structure either doesn't work anymore, or is quite sort of unsettling. So there's not even within this sort of analysis that or reading, I think, like Smith. But on the other hand, you sort of think, well, what would be the point in reading Smith and going, oh yeah, what he says has no bearing on what I might think that, but I wouldn't write a piece on it. I write about things that I think speak to me, whether they speak through consonants or because they're challenging is a different point. I write quite a bit about Hobbes, as you know, and Hobbes for me is both consonant but also very challenging. So there's different reasons to read and write and think through these old texts. George, no, it's really good. I've got to think about monism and dualism. I hate that debate, so I have to think about it in this context. And I think there's something in that. I think that's really, really productive to think about Smith and the tradition in which he's sort of working and operating here as sort of moving to some extent in the direction of monism. I think there's still quite a lot that's sort of potentially dualist there, but then you'd expect that. But I think there's enough in there to sort of start thinking in these terms as on the road to monism. There's a lot of connection here. The more you believe what I'm saying about the sort of federative arrangements that he would have liked to see the world pattern in, there's a lot of connection with Kant and the essay on perpetual peace. I think the stuff is richer and better, but that's a different thing. I don't think that's Kant at its best, but still, it's interesting to see those crossover points, and they're right, pretty much contemporaneously, this sort of stuff. So that sort of works too. But I will think about it more. I think it's really, really interesting. Philip's point, Scotland, I've never thought about that. It's excellent because obviously he would have understood. He was obviously Scottish and obviously a supporter of the Union. And he would have seen it exactly as a federal bargain. Albeit one that creates a state rather than a federative arrangement between two independent polities, but he would have seen it both as a federal structure and one that was utterly beneficial. I mean, he's swingingly critical of Scotland, and sees in a sense that union as the way in which sort of Scotland accelerates to being a modern polity or part of a modern polity. And also, it was sort of beneficial to England in the wider sense too, but definitely would have understood it as being utterly beneficial in the Scottish case. I think that's right. It just occurred to me when you're talking about the way in which you understand Blackstone. Talk about Blackstone understanding, sort of reading sovereignty, particularly the sovereignty of the king. Really strong sentence in his chapter 2 on prerogative. It's interesting because he says similar things about Parliament. so he has to some extent. I'm not an avid fan of Blackstone, but there is some consonance between the two, despite Blackstone being much more of a prerogative lawyer than obviously Smith or many other contemporaries who are not of Blackstone's disposition on that front. But it's interesting, there's a consonance that probably stems from both being, I hadn't realised it, but Blackstone is massively influenced by Montesquieu. So I was reading Dicey, some of his essays on comparative constitutionalism the other day, and he just stipulated, he said, oh yeah, of course, Blackstone is completely in the shadow of Montesquieu. He's translating Montesquieu into the idiom of sort of analytical jurisprudence in his own day in respect of the British Constitution. It's quite interesting. So if that to the extent that's true, and it is true, and Montesquieu's influencing both Blackstone and Smith and many others, it's in a sense unsurprising that they're drawing somewhat similar conclusions about the way in which these powers are distinct, but also aligned through balancing out and sort of a contestated harmony or something like that.
Thank you. And just touching on this final national note, Hugh McDermott said there have been Scots ó Hehén thoughts, they're strewn through various lots. And to translate that into the sort of bastardised estuary English that you speak down here, what it means is that Scotland has its philosophers, but their ideas have not always come down to us with the clarity that we might have. So thank you for recovering these ideas, for presenting them so clearly, for exploring them, for explaining them to us. Thank you very much.